Hello to my now 429 subscribers. Thank you so much for subscribing. And to the 10, 15, 20, sometimes 100 people who watch my videos, thank you so much for watching and interacting with my content. Now, if you've been following or watching my videos, you would know that my channel is pretty much mostly focused on the family, the importance of the family as a support system, and the family unit functioning in the role that it was essentially created to function as, and also the importance or the awareness of the fact that survival mode is a real psychological disorder that has neurological serious, significant neurological impact on our lives. The way we think, the way we respond, just the way we do life is impacted by how we're programmed to live. So now, in this video, I want to just look at some survival mode, some symptoms of survival mode as it relates to your mental and your cognitive functions. Now, if you're living in what survival mode is, so we all have a security mechanism naturally set up in our body, which is called survival mode or survival instinct. Survival instinct is supposed to come on board when we're facing danger. So our survival instinct comes on board just like your car system, the safety features of your car come on board. Like now, in most of the new car models that they're designing, one of the main safety features is it can detect when your car gets close to another vehicle or just anything at all. It gets too close, then the alarm goes off. Our survival instinct functions, or is supposed to function in that same way, to alert us to when there's danger, or once we recognize that there's danger, then our survival instinct chips in and it helps us to navigate, whether we need to jump, run, hide, scream, whatever it is that we need to do in that moment for self-preservation and to preserve our lives in that moment. That's what our survival instinct is there for. Now, what has happened to a lot of us, myself included, has had this experience, is that we have lived for so long. Our survival mode turned on, was engaged, came on board as children, and it basically never turned off. It did not turn off. So we have been living and functioning and operating and doing life in a prolonged state of survival instinct that then turns into survival mode. Now, survival mode, like anything else, when it's overdone, it becomes a negative for the individual rather than a positive. So sustained survival mode, it shuts down and short circuits your system. So prolonged survival mode shuts down and short circuits the natural way or the natural functioning of the human body. Now, when those natural functions become short circuit and they become something else, we take on those identities and we are programmed into thinking, or we convince ourselves into thinking that that is just who we are. Jamaicans are famous for saying "Asomitan." In my case, that I can speak of, what I now know, is that I used to think that being impulsive was just my personality. It's just who I am. I was always quick to respond. I was always very defensive. I was very emotionally unregulated, which I thought was passion. I thought I was just a passionate person, but it turns out I was just emotionally unregulated. So when you've lived in survival mode for so long and it short circuits your normal operating system, which is the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and those other parts of your brain that are designed to help you to navigate life. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for long-term thinking and planning and regulation and that sort of thing. So when those things don't get developed because you've been living in survival mode for so long, then you are short circuit, you're underdeveloped, and you don't even realize. And you're living life and living life and living life thinking that, hey, this is just me, it's just my personality. And you're in survival mode, and everything just becomes so much harder than it really needs to be, because you're pushing a boulder up a hill when you could easily well just be cruising and going along. So some of the symptoms of living in survival mode from a mental and cognitive perspective is that you're in constant worry or anxiety. So you're always worrying, and that also could manifest itself in an attitude or a personality trait of you become a perfectionist. Like everything has to be perfect, everything has to be perfect. That's also a survival mode manifestation. You have difficulty concentrating, like you can't focus on anything. You just can't focus, therefore you can't really think long term. And so because you can't think long term, you are now programmed into short term thinking, which also is where the impulsiveness comes from. Because you can't think further than your nose, you can't think further than this moment, you are unable to think beyond just this situation, beyond surviving this moment, getting through this moment, feeding yourself for this moment. You're unable to think beyond that. And then the other extent of that is, at the other end of the spectrum of that is you're an overthinker. You overthink everything, and you basically oscillate from short-term thinking to overthinking. So it's either from one end to the next, from one end to the next. You're either in panic mode, or you are just thinking about this moment, not giving a crap about, or you're unable, not that you don't give a crap, but you're unable to think beyond this moment. So you oscillate between overthinking and short-term thinking. And then there is just the catastrophizing everything, like the world is coming to an end. It's like everything is just, oh my God, there is lack, there is, woe is me, the victim mentality. That's where everything comes from, all of that. And I have been through and experienced or lived from most, if not all, of these symptoms at some point or another in my life. Difficulty making decisions, because in order to make decisions, your prefrontal cortex has to be developed, and your prefrontal cortex requires safety as a baseline for you to be able to think and function normally, and to first of all, believe that you have a future, believe that there's a future and you're going to, reach it, in order for you to be able to plan for said future. And one of the deep, unconscious, subconscious symptoms that is buried deep down that we operate from as people who live constantly in survival mode is that we don't have a future. We may not live beyond a certain time. We're not going to live beyond a certain time because you feel like you're such a bad person. You're struggling to survive that you may not. Any day now, you don't think you're going to live past. And I remember vividly, like, my experience with going through that phase of my life. Yeah. And then so the final one for this video is mental fatigue and brain fog, which basically on some level is tied back to difficulty making decisions. Because if you're fatigued mentally or you're experiencing brain fog, then you can't really think long term or make difficult decisions. So in survival mode, the brain's prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for planning and reasoning, becomes less active, while the amygdala, which is responsible for threat detection, becomes dominant. So the roles have been reversed. So the amygdala is supposed to only come online momentarily for specific situations. And the prefrontal cortex is where you're supposed to be living from. It's supposed to be active 24/7 because that's your executive brain function. But for those of us who are living in survival mode, the roles are reversed. So the prefrontal cortex becomes dormant and the amygdala becomes the dominant part of the brain, becomes where you're living from instead of the prefrontal cortex. So survival mode is real, and the part of it that a lot of people can, if we take the time out to really look into it and to pay attention, is our inability to think and to plan long term. That is one of the most common and the most significant of living in survival mode, is that you just cannot, no matter what you do, you can't fix it unless you become aware that you're functioning in survival mode. And the basis of making the transition from survival mode to living and thriving and being present is safety. Safety is at the core and the basis of that. And that's why the family unit is important, because our sense of safety initially starts there. And now if we don't feel safe in our family as children, and we jump into survival instinct and we're unable to switch off survival instinct, then it becomes survival mode. And we are living our lives in survival mode constantly. So we are only living for the moment, just for the moment.